Welcome to our MSCI 445 presentation, a technical overview on man-in-the-middle attacks. This slide outlines what we will be discussing in the presentation. So what is a man-in-the-middle attack? Man-in-the-middle attacks are one of the oldest forms of cyber attacks. They have occurred since the early 1980s. On a general level, they can be described as security breaches caused by an external interference between the communication of two parties, as can be seen in the diagram. They are used by attackers to spy on communications in order to steal personal information such as login credentials or to manipulate traffic. How do man-in-the-middle attacks work? They can occur from the attacker being in physical proximity to the target using a Wi-Fi access point or through malicious software. There are a wide range of techniques that can be used to conduct man-in-the-middle attack depending on the targets and desired outcome of a hacker, some of which we will be discussing later on in this presentation. On a general level, each of these types of attacks has two different phases. Firstly, the interception phase, where the attacker infiltrates a network and then intercepts users' traffic. And secondly, the decryption phase, where attacker decrypts the traffic and redirects the data. Man-in-the-middle attacks are difficult to detect due to their passive nature and the ability of attackers to re-encrypt and send traffic that has been tampered with back to the user.
There are so many different types of man-in-the-middle attacks targeting different levels of the Internet Protocol stack, whether it's the application layer or the network layer. Spoofing in general, whether it's DNS, IP, or ARP, is essentially the act of disguising a communication from an unknown source as a trusted source. We're going to be going over IP spoofing further into the presentation, and Gazelle is going to be going over ARP spoofing later in the presentation as well. Another type is session hijacking. There are two main types, including TCP and cookie stealing, and I'll be going over session hijacking through cookies. Email hijacking is essentially hijacking via email. Another type is Wi-Fi eavesdropping, and we're going to have a live simulation of this, but essentially it's when a hacker steals data on a public insecure network. And lastly, cookie insertion and stealing is a common type which can be accomplished through various techniques, and it also relates to session hijacking.
We'll now take a look at a few real-life examples of man-in-the-middle attacks that have occurred over the years. The concept of a man-in-the-middle attack has been around long before computers were even invented. One example of this is the Babington Plot. In 1568, supporters of an imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, wrote to her asking for her support in the assassination of Queen Elizabeth I. Mary's response was intercepted by spy agents working for the Queen, who altered her letter by asking for the identities of the conspirators. Once the supporters replied with all the requested identities, the letter was intercepted again by the men in the middle, which led to the execution of Mary and all the co-conspirators. This second example occurred in 2013, when a collection of NSA documents were leaked to the public, uncovering that the U.S. National Security Agency had posed as Google by intercepting traffic and spoofing SSL certificates. This made it possible to spy on anyone's Google searches. The documents revealed that data was rerouted to the NSA Central without either users or Google noticing. The attack was carried out by creating fake security certificates to prevent creating a secure connection through SSL cryptographic protocol that is intended to authenticate websites. In the same year, a number of man-in-the-middle attacks were reported targeting European companies. 49 suspects were arrested for the suspicion of conducting man-in-the-middle attacks to sniff out email communications and intercept payment requests. Some of these attacks were carried out by social engineering in order to plant malware into companies' networks, which gave them illegitimate access to the corporate emails in order to monitor communications. ABSA, one of the big four banks in South Africa, was targeted by the attackers replicating ABSA's web page by ripping off their HTML and JavaScript code. This replicated interface was used in phishing emails where customers were asked to input their password and a random verification number that ABSA sent to mobile phones. After the sensitive data was captured, the attackers used this to set up simultaneous transactions with a real bank website. These series of attacks resulted in international fraud totaling $6.8 million USD.
Now we'll be looking at different types of man-in-the-middle attacks and how they affect different layers of the protocol stack. First, let's start with the application layer, specifically looking at one of the most popular man-in-the-middle attacks called session hijacking. Session hijacking is an attack where a user is taken over by an attacker. I'm sure you already know, but a session starts when you log into a service. This can be anything from your Facebook account to your online banking. In session hacking, the attacker relies on the user's session cookies, and although any computer sessions can be hijacked, session hijacking mainly applies to browser or web apps. Cookies are a feature of HTTP, which is an application layer protocol, and so it's included under this section. Most browsers these days use cookies. The server sets a temporary session cookie in the browser to remember that you're logged in and authenticated. Session cookies are the best way for a server to identify your browser in session. From the cookies, the attacker needs to know the session ID, which can either be stolen or obtained in other ways we'll be covering in a bit. But basically, once the user is authenticated, the attacker can do anything the original user was authorized to do during the active session. This can include anything from transferring money from the user's account to accessing personal information for identity theft. Now, these are all personal consequences, so you may wonder, what about organizations? Since cookies can be used to identify authenticated users for single sign-on, it's one of the largest threats to organizations. So going over other methods to obtain the session cookies, cookies can be obtained through XSS, which is when an attacker injects client-side scripts into web pages. The script runs when the page is loaded and accesses your session ID. And we can see this in figure 1. The attacker injects a script, that's step 1. Victim authenticates on server. Server returns page code with injected script. Victim's browser executes a script and sends session cookie to the attacker. So this is one of the main ones. Another main method is through session sidejacking, in which packet sniffing is used to intercept session cookies after a user has logged in to a website. And we can see this in figure 2. The victim logs in using their username and password, and the attacker is using packet sniffing to intercept the session cookies. And some other examples can include session fixation and cookie theft through malware. Let's take a look at some prevention techniques. Some prevention techniques include using the HTTPS protocol instead of HTTP. This will prevent the attacker from getting the plain text session ID even if they're monitoring the traffic. Another option is to set the HTTP only attribute to prevent access to cookies from client-side scripts. Moving on, we have use web frameworks instead of handling session management on your own. As web frameworks are really secure and have been tested for session ID generation. Another option is to regenerate the session key after the initial authentication, which nullifies any previous efforts. And lastly, perform additional measures for identity verification, along with cookies, such as checking the user's usual IP address when logged in.
Transport and network layer. As we learned in lectures, each computer network has an IP which it uses to connect your computer to other devices on your network and to access the internet. In IP spoofing, an attacker uses the IP address of another device to get access to communications. For a man-in-the-middle attack, the attacker spoofs the IP of both the client and the server. They use tools to modify the destination IP address in the packet header for the client and source IP address in the header for the server. As can be seen in this diagram to the right-hand side, the spoof source IP coming from the attacker is actually the IP of the client. The attacker is able to covertly intercept communications between the two parties as the victims send packets to the attacker instead of directly to one another. The biggest defense against man-in-the-middle attacks through IP spoofing is using encrypted communications. An attacker intercepting encrypted traffic won't be able to read or manipulate the contents of the traffic. At an organizational level, IT specialists deploy tooling to monitor networks for abnormal activity and use robust verification methods to detect for inconsistencies to prevent IP spoofing.
Next is the data link layer. As covered in this course, the Address Resolution Protocol (ARP) is a communication protocol used to resolve IP addresses and MAC addresses via the data link layer. A client host will need to send an ARP request to the TCP IP network to obtain a physical address. However, ARP lacks an authentication protocol, which makes it vulnerable to a type of man-in-the-middle attack known as ARP spoofing. This unsecure connection allows an attacker to send fake or spoofed ARP messages to the local area network and map the attacking MAC address to the host's IP address. This allows the attacker to intercept all traffic of the target host and use the data being transferred for spying or altering communications. This type of attack can be mitigated by adding static ARP entries to the cache so that the network will rely on the local cache instead. Now we're going to be showing you how a type of attack actually works using this demo. I shop near my house, got my iced latte, and since my Wi-Fi at home was down, I've come here so I could do some of my online banking because they have an open network here that I can use, which is great. So I'm just going to put in my username and password and log in.
Hey, I'm the man in the middle. I spend my Saturdays at Starbucks trying to get any information I can from naive coffee addicts who don't know the dangers of the internet. I set up a personal hotspot, faking as Starbucks Wi-Fi, to get users to fall into my trap. Looks like we have someone using our hotspot. Let's wait till they sign into an application so we can take a look at some of the data we got. So Gazelle has just signed into her online banking app. Let's see if we're able to capture some data. So this is the post method for the login. And going all the way down, we have the HTML form. And in the form, we can see that Gazelle's username was Gazelle M, and the password she used was man in the middle attack. So now I can use this username and password to log into our banking app and do whatever I want. As a side note, I do want to mention that my job's been getting harder by the day as more and more apps are starting to use the HTTPS protocol. This ensures SSL and TLS encryption of all session traffic. Although man-in-the-middle attacks have decreased in use over time due to the increasing popularity of malware attacks that are simpler to conduct, they are commonly used to conduct more targeted attacks that are highly sophisticated.
Prevention techniques. Herewith outline some steps that you can take in order to prevent yourself from becoming a victim of man-in-the-middle attacks. Firstly is enable two-factor authentication. 2FA is a second form of identification that significantly decreases the risk that an attacker can gain access to your accounts. Secondly, take network precautions. Avoid Wi-Fi connections that are not password protected. Don't use public networks, such as coffee shops or hotels, when conducting sensitive transactions. And third point is especially important if you're working remotely, is to use a corporate VPN. Encourage your employer to create a corporate VPN if they don't already have one. Third, use HTTPS. Be attentive towards browser notifications that report websites as insecure, and refrain from entering any personal information to websites that use HTTP. And lastly, ensure that you have strong router login credentials. Change your default router login. If an attacker finds your router credentials, they can change your DNS servers to their malicious servers or infect your router with malicious software. Thanks for watching our presentation. We look forward to your questions.